Okay, so today we're taking this deep dive into the world of big tech
Yeah.
and their impact on democracy.
Yeah.
Using Marietje Schaake's book, The Tech Coup, as our guide.
It's a really fascinating book.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we all kind of feel, right? Like this power that Silicon Valley has.
Absolutely.
And how it's impacting our lives. But this book really digs deep into it in a way that I think is really eye-opening.
Yeah, it really does. And you know what's interesting is how it's not just this like abstract tech story.
Right.
It's about real people.
Yeah.
And their fight for democratic freedoms in a world that's increasingly shaped by technology.
Yeah, I mean, remember when the internet was supposed to be this great democratizing force?
Yeah.
Like everyone was going to have a voice. And
It was gonna be so
like, beautiful thing.
The utopian vision.
Yeah. And Schaake kind of reminds us that it hasn't quite worked out that way.
Not exactly. Yeah.
She takes us back to the Arab Spring. I mean, I remember that so vividly, being glued to Twitter, thinking, wow.
Social media is sparking revolutions.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But Schaake kind of paints a more complicated picture, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. She talks about how this assumption that social media was the driving force behind the Arab Spring is actually a bit of a myth.
Oh, interesting.
She interviewed Ali, an Iranian activist
Okay.
who was organizing protests in Iran during that time. And contrary to what many people believe, he actually relied mainly on traditional methods like word of mouth, text messages, because he knew that social media, while it seemed open, was also a tool for surveillance.
I didn't even consider that. Like,
It's easy to forget that those concerns were there even back then. And it gets even more complicated when you consider companies like Nokia Siemens.
Okay.
They were selling cell phone surveillance tech to the Iranian government.
Oh, wow.
The same tech that was then used to track down and arrest activists like Ali.
Okay.
So it's a stark reminder that even in those early days, the ethical lines were already very blurry. And some companies were all too eager to profit from repression.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It's like this promise of connection and communication, but then behind the scenes, there are these companies that are already exploiting it for control and surveillance.
It's like this classic example of early optimism kind of blinding us to the potential downsides. And those dilemmas haven't gone away, right? In fact, they've just become even more tangled as these tech companies have gained more and more power.
And speaking of power, let's talk about how these tech companies went from these scrappy startups in Silicon Valley to the behemoths that they are today.
Right.
I mean, remember Google's old motto, "Don't be evil"?
Right.
Like, it feels almost ironic now.
It does, doesn't it? Because the early internet, as envisioned by someone like Tim Berners-Lee, was supposed to be this open and decentralized space.
Right.
But somewhere along the way, the desire for profit and market dominance kind of took over.
Yeah, and I feel like the Uber Greyball scandal is such a perfect example of that shift.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that for people who might not know the story?
Yeah, so Uber Greyball essentially was this program that Uber created where they had a fake version of their app.
Wow.
That they would use to deceive authorities who were trying to regulate them.
Like they were trying to catch Ubers that weren't like operating legally or something.
Exactly.
And so they had this whole system set up.
They were one step ahead
Wow.
of the authorities.
Wow. So it's like they thought they were above the law, basically.
It's almost as if they felt like they were operating in this space where the rules didn't apply to them.
Yeah.
Which is a very dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, and they weren't the only company that's been accused of that.
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. It's like a pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
And what's even more concerning is how these companies have then leveraged that power to influence the very rules.
Exactly. That are meant to govern them.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that. Let's unpack this whole big tech goes to Washington saga, because we all know about lobbying, right? Like, that's not new.
That's the old way.
Right? But Schaake is showing how their influence goes much deeper than that.
It's much more insidious. It's about embedding themselves into the very fabric of government.
Right.
So you have people like David Plouffe, who was Obama's campaign manager.
Right.
Went on to work for Uber.
Wow.
And then the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative.
Wow.
So you have this revolving door between Silicon Valley and Washington.
Right. And is that just about expertise?
Right.
Or is it about blurring these lines in a way that's...
It's hard to say where one ends and the other begins.
Right.
That's what's so worrying.
And then you've got Section 230.
Yes.
Which, you know, how everyone's always talking about holding social media companies responsible for what people are posting.
The harmful content?
Yeah, all of that stuff.
Well, Section 230 is a big part of why that's so difficult.
Absolutely.
It was originally intended to protect free speech online.
Right.
But it's become this shield for tech companies.
A loophole that they can exploit.
And so they can basically allow all of this harmful content.
And they can wash their hands of it.
Yeah.
To a certain extent.
Yeah.
It's a classic example of how well-intentioned policies can have these really unintended consequences, especially when technology evolves faster than our ability to regulate it.
Yeah.
And this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how tech is influencing our lives in ways that we don't always see or understand.
Right, because there's this whole other layer to this, right?
Absolutely.
It's like we think about the internet as this magical thing. But there's a whole physical world behind it.
There is a physical reality to the internet that we often forget about.
And Schaake calls it the hidden infrastructure of power.
Yeah.
And it's not about algorithms or code. It's about the actual physical stuff that makes the internet tick.
Fiber optic cables.
Yeah.
Data centers. Undersea cables.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Microchips.
All this stuff that we never think about.
Right.
But it's crucial to our digital lives.
It's like the plumbing of the internet.
Yeah.
We don't think about it until it's broken.
And often this infrastructure is more vulnerable than we realize.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's way more vulnerable. And, you know, she talks about those massive data centers that are popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
Often in rural communities.
Yeah.
With the promise of jobs and investment.
Right.
But what's the real cost?
Yeah, what is the real cost?
You know, what are the downsides?
Because it's not all rosy, is it?
It's not all rosy.
Yeah.
No. There are some serious downsides.
Like what kind of downsides are we talking about?
Well, first of all, the environmental impact is huge.
Okay. Yeah.
These data centers use an insane amount of energy.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Like enough to power a small city. And they require massive amounts of water for cooling.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Which puts a huge strain on local resources.
Yeah.
Especially in areas that are already facing water shortages.
Yeah, that
makes sense. So that's a major concern.
Right.
But it's not just the environmental piece.
Okay.
Schaake also talks about how these tech giants will often strike these deals with local governments.
Oh, really?
That are incredibly favorable to the company.
Okay.
But leave the communities with minimal benefits.
Oh, wow.
So they're
not a whole lot of environmental headaches.
kind of like swooping in,
Right.
making promises, and then not really delivering.
Promising the world, but not delivering.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the power imbalance at play.
Okay.
You have these small towns who are eager for economic development.
Yeah.
And they're often ill-equipped to really negotiate with these tech behemoths that have
They have teams of lawyers.
armies of lawyers.
Yeah.
Endless resources.
Yeah.
It's a totally uneven playing field. It's like David and Goliath.
Exactly.
And it's not just data centers, right?
No, not just data centers.
Schaake takes us even deeper into this hidden infrastructure, talking about microchips, undersea cables.
Yeah, the arteries of the internet carrying our data.
Across continents.
Cross continents, yeah.
But they're surprisingly vulnerable.
They are very vulnerable.
Like, I think about that story a while back.
Yeah.
The suspected Russian sabotage of those undersea cables.
Well, the coast of Norway.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a spy thriller.
I know, right?
But it just shows how this infrastructure is not just a technical matter.
Right.
It's a geopolitical chessboard.
Yeah, you would never think about that.
Right.
Something as mundane as an undersea cable.
Right, exactly.
Could be so critical.
But it is because control over those systems equals power.
That's true.
And then remember the whole microchip shortage we had?
Oh yeah, a couple years ago.
It brought entire industries to a standstill, highlighting just how reliant we are on these tiny pieces of technology.
Yeah, and I remember at that time people were talking about how, you know, most of them are produced in like 1 or 2 countries.
Exactly, handful of countries.
And so if something happens, you know, politically or whatever, suddenly we don't have.
It's a massive vulnerability.
Microchips.
Supply chain vulnerabilities, national security risks, all of that.
So it's like we've outsourced this really critical part of our digital infrastructure.
You've outsourced it without fully realizing the implications.
Yeah, without really thinking about
the
long-term consequences.
And it's not just about data privacy anymore.
Right.
It's about global power dynamics.
Wow.
The stability of the entire digital world.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It is a lot. And that actually brings us to what I think is Shaake's most urgent point,
Okay.
which is how all of this impacts democracy itself.
It feels like all of this is leading to something pretty big.
It is, yeah, and this is where Schaake really doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
She argues that we're facing a full-on tech coup,
Wow.
where technology, instead of empowering democracy,
Right.
is being used to undermine it.
Okay, so paint that picture for me.
Okay.
What does a tech coup actually look like in the real world?
Well, I mean, we all know about election interference,
Right.
disinformation campaigns.
Cambridge Analytica, that was in
Well,
faith.
Cambridge Analytica was a huge wake-up call.
Yeah,
But Schaake argues that that was really just the tip of the iceberg.
okay.
She says these platforms have become so sophisticated
Right.
at manipulating what we see,
Yeah.
what we believe.
It's like, we know that there are targeted ads following us around,
Right.
but is it even more insidious than that?
Oh, it's way more insidious than that. I mean, think about it.
Okay.
Algorithms can now target us based on like our deepest fears, our biases,
Wow.
our psychological profiles,
So they know.
and they can do it with incredible precision,
So it's not just like,
feeding us personalized propaganda
wow.
that's designed to push our buttons and influence our behavior.
It's like having a whisper campaign.
Exactly.
That's tailored just for you.
Just for you.
That's both amazing and terrifying at the same time.
Right. Well, that's the thing about technology. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not just about elections either.
Right.
She also talks about how governments are increasingly outsourcing these really core functions
Okay.
to tech companies,
Like what?
especially when it comes to security
Okay.
and surveillance.
Give me an example.
So she talks about Palantir,
Okay.
this company that was born from the CIA
Oh, wow.
and is now like deeply embedded in U.S. government operations.
Really?
From immigration enforcement to battlefield intelligence.
Wow.
They're providing all these powerful surveillance tools,
Huh?
data analysis tools.
Yeah.
But there's very little transparency
So how do we even know?
or accountability.
Right. It's like, who's actually in control?
Exactly.
Is it our elected officials
Right.
or is it these tech companies?
With their algorithms and their troves of data.
It feels like we're sleepwalking into a dystopian sci-fi movie.
That's how it can feel.
Yeah.
And Schaake doesn't deny that it's a daunting challenge,
Right.
but she also argues that it's not hopeless.
Okay, good.
She believes that we can reclaim our digital future,
Okay, so what do we do?
but it's going to require a pretty radical shift in our thinking.
Like what?
Well, for one, she's very clear that self-regulation is not the answer.
Okay.
All those tech for good pledges, corporate social responsibility initiatives,
Yeah, like they sound good on the surface.
they sound nice, but they lack teeth.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Exactly.
Okay.
She points to Facebook's oversight board
Okay.
as a perfect example. Like,
Yeah.
it's full of these really impressive names,
Okay.
academics, experts.
Yeah.
But does it really have the power to hold Facebook accountable?
Right.
Schaake would argue that it's more about PR
Right.
than real change.
Okay, so self-regulation's not going to cut it. Then what is?
Well, she calls for a new playbook,
Okay.
one that prioritizes democratic values
Okay.
over corporate profits.
I like the sound of that.
She proposes things like a precautionary principle
Okay, what's that?
for new technologies,
Oh.
meaning that we need to carefully assess the potential risks of any new technology before it's released into the wild.
So it's like taking a breath,
Exactly.
hitting the pause button.
Instead of move fast and break things.
Right, but like let's actually think about this for a second
Right,
before
right.
we unleash something that could backfire in a major way.
She also stresses the need for far greater transparency
Okay.
from tech companies.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to their algorithms
Wow.
and their data practices.
So no more of these black boxes.
No more black boxes.
We deserve to know how these systems are making decisions
We deserve to know.
that affect our lives.
Absolutely.
But I have to say, even if they do all that, isn't this a bit much for the average person to take on? Right.
Like, I'm busy just trying to live my life.
Right, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
This isn't just about governments passing laws
Right.
or tech companies changing their ways.
Yeah.
Schaake argues that we all have a role to play
Okay. I like a call to action. So what can we do?
in shaping a better digital future.
Besides, like, deleting all my social media accounts and living in a cave.
Right. It's not about unplugging entirely.
Yeah.
It's about being more conscious consumers.
All right.
We need to be asking these companies tough questions
Okay.
about their data practices,
Yeah.
their algorithms,
Yeah.
support organizations that are working to build more democratic alternatives
Like what?
to these big tech platforms,
Okay.
like Ethan Zuckerman's initiative for digital public infrastructure.
So it's about putting our money where our values are.
Exactly.
Supporting companies and organizations that are actually aligned with what we believe in.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's about having these conversations,
Yeah.
raising awareness,
Right.
not being afraid to demand better.
From the companies that have become so embedded in our lives.
It's interesting because for a while there, I was feeling kind of overwhelmed by this whole tech coup thing.
Yeah.
It felt very big and scary. And
It's easy to feel powerless.
Right.
In the face of these tech giants.
But what you're saying is we're not powerless.
We're not powerless.
We can make choices.
Yeah.
We can demand better. We can support organizations that are fighting for
Exactly.
a more democratic digital future.
It starts with awareness.
Right.
And then taking action.
Well said. On that note, a huge thank you to Marietje Schaake for writing this book, The Tech Coup.
Yes.
For sounding the alarm on this really critical issue.
Absolutely.
And to you, dear listener, for diving deep with us into this very complex and very important topic.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope that you'll continue to explore these issues.
Ask tough questions.
Ask those tough questions. Demand better.
Demand better.
From the tech companies that have become so central to our lives.
It's on all of us.
Because really, the future of our democracy might just depend on it.
I agree.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
It's your